Hi everyone, my name is Miles Gray. I'm a lab leader for the GDDI, and I'm going to give a lecture today on speaking and giving redos. Before we get started, I want to note that I have created a little worksheet for you all to follow along, to write notes, and kind of do some of the activities I'm putting in the lecture so that you have a little bit more of an active way to participate. So it'd be a little bit more like we were all giving the lecture and taking notes in person instead of online. So if you want to find that, you can go to Canvas. Then Files, then Speaking Lecture Worksheet. And I recommend printing that out before watching the rest of the video. So pausing now and printing. If you're in the GDDI, you can find that worksheet also on our Slack under the General tab. So I'm going to divide this lecture into two main sections, and the first section will be on giving speeches. And that section is further divided into goals and pitfalls. So I'm going to hopefully help us establish goals for our speaking, both for the camp as well as the broader, your broader time in debate, as well as identify some places where debaters go wrong when they're giving speeches. We're also going to talk about speaking mechanics. So, the physical aspects of giving speeches, the efficiency and organization of giving a speech, which all kind of fall under your ability to do speaking and debate. Okay, so first are goals. And an important thing to remember when setting a goal for speaking is that speed is the number of ideas effectively communicated per minute. A misconception that a lot of debaters have is that they must be as absolutely fast as possible. And while it is true that speed is an enormous advantage in debate and it is good for us to improve our speed, that's not the end goal, and that ideas that are communicated so fast that they can't be written down is ultimately useless because the judge will not vote on things, ideally, that they don't hear. So we want to build goals that are not just based on how many words per minute we can speak or talking as fast as possible, but rather more qualitative ways to improve our performance in debates. So there's lots of different ways to write goals, and I encourage you to either pause the video or to quickly write down something in the little box that I've included on the worksheet, or if you're not following along on the worksheet, just think about what concrete way can you commit yourself to improving your speaking? And I'm going to write a couple examples. The first is I want to be clearer on tags and card text. So that card text and tags, I guess. So that would mean that I'm committing myself to going clearer, maybe slowing down or enunciating some more on the body of cards as well as on the tags. Another example could be a little bit more concrete, like I want to be able to cover two advantages and two DAs in one 2NC. So I want to be able to do a really big horizontal 2NC. And having speed and efficiency are both necessary for pulling off a strategy like that, because ultimately it requires you to communicate effectively a lot of ideas in only 8 minutes. So those are kind of two examples of goals, but there are plenty that ultimately you can have in order to improve your speaking. And I encourage you to constantly revisit this throughout the summer and throughout the next year to monitor your progress. Don't just write something down and never come back to it, because ultimately that will have been a wasted goal. Okay, so in addition to goals, there are also plenty of pitfalls and common mistakes. And so I've listed some of them here. So maybe the biggest is one that I've basically already talked about, but it's so important, I'll repeat it, which is that a lot of people sacrifice clarity for speed, and we do not want to do that. Instead, we should always remember clarity trumps speed, especially if what we're saying otherwise could not be understood. Debate is ultimately about communication, even though we do it at basically alien speeds. Another common misunderstanding, they're faster than me and therefore I cannot win. That's not true. Boo. But instead, it's about recognizing when you need to be more efficient or more organized if your opponent is just a machine gun of speed. However, there's also kind of the opposite misunderstanding, which is that they might be faster than me, but I am persuasive and the parents love me, And while, it's very cute that the parents love you and, you do great in front of them, they would love you no matter what. And also, sometimes we do need to be quicker and more efficient and more organized when we're facing opponents that are also fast and efficient and organized. Another kind of cardinal sin of speaking is the assumption that the opponent or your judge can just follow along in the doc. Any judge worth their salt is not going to do that. They're just not going to write down what you're saying, and then, they're going to treat everything you just spent saying as if it did not exist, which you don't want. And maybe even worse is you following along in the doc because you'll miss arguments or answer arguments that were never said and get disorganized. And it's just a way to advertise to everyone in the room that you don't know what you're doing. So we absolutely never, ever, ever want to do this. Never. It's so bad and kind of embarrassing. So do not follow along on the doc ever. Absolutely not. 0% of the time. Horrible. Okay. So more important than all of those, though, is the most important pitfall to avoid, which is not reading all of the highlighted words. This is like a really serious offense. I'm going to highlight it there so that you know. It's called clipping cards, and it basically violates one of the fundamental promises that we have in debate, that we will act with academic integrity. And so if you've highlighted words and you've claimed to have read them in a card, you need to say all of them. No chopping off the last syllable in a word, not skipping words, skipping sentences. It's absolutely not worth it. And it's also just a horrible thing. So to really impress this into your brains, I've included a little space on the worksheet just to write the sentence. I will read all of the highlighted words. Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, just to really tell you how much I mean it. Now you have no excuse to forget. You've written it down. It's burned into your brain forever. There is a small exception, which is that if you're marking a card, so I'll add a little star, marking, which means you're announcing and marking in your own speech document when you've stopped a card early, and you need to do both of those things. So you must announce the mark as you're doing it. So you might say mark the card at, and then the word that you're marking, and then also put it in your doc immediately. So there's both a verbal record and a written record of exactly what was read, because ultimately the point of clipping cards is, or the point of avoiding clipping cards, that we want to make sure that both sides and the judge know what words were said and which were not. And so marking is a way that if you have to stop a card early, we can, make sure that everyone's being accountable. Great. So I want to move on now to the second component, which is speaking mechanics. So aside from all those other things, it's good to know about the physical things that go into being a good speaker. And the first two are your voice and your breathing. So the breathing is, in between your voice and in between the words. Spreading should be in your normal voice, but just faster. But it's really important. I'm going to highlight it, normal voice, because we don't want you to sound weird or different. You want to instead preserve your tone and preserve your pitch. So if you normally speak in a really low voice, you don't want to speak in a suddenly really high, weird voice when you're reading cards, but try to keep it continuous. And also, you don't want any weird background noises or humming when you're talking. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, record yourself speaking and listen. And if it sounds like someone's operating like a lawnmower in the background or launching an airplane, it's because you're humming while you're talking. And getting rid of that habit is really important because it sounds really distracting when you're judging or when you're listening to someone else talk. Conversely, speaking should not be your normal breathing, just like it does need to be your normal voice. We need to actually make some changes to how we breathe. And the biggest change is that we need to choose opportune times, like between sentences or between cards. And that is a little bit counterintuitive because normally we breathe without thinking. But when we're reading cards or giving a debate speech, we need to actively be thinking about when we're breathing in order to make sure that it's happening at times that are not interfering with conveying ideas effectively. So there are many different times, and there's not a perfect rule, but in general, you kind of want to put breaths after some of the following, or at natural stopping points, like after tags, after sentences, after authors, or after cards. And there's a few other places, like between paragraphs or in between subpoints. And, there's lots of different places when you could consider a time to stop. But ultimately, it's important that you focus on, choosing times that make the most sense. So I have here, or also what you should do is there should only be one breath when you're breathing. So no double breaths or anything like that. It's just one strong breath, and then you get back to reading your words. And I have a little YouTube video here to show you what a lot of debaters accidentally sound like when they're giving speeches. So this is what we want to avoid. This is what a lot of you sound like. Can we keep it going to really press it into your mind? Okay, so you get the point. That was like 30 breaths, but even double breaths are worth avoiding. So, make sure to remember one breath only. Great. Okay. So a few other mechanics. When you're spreading, you also want to be stationary. No dancing or flapping your wings. If you do that, this is what you look like. It's not majestic, although like this bird, it just looks terrible. So stay still, grab the legs of the table toad if you have to stay still, but you're not a bird. Don't pretend to be a bird when you're giving your speeches. This is you. When you do that, it's bad. Okay. So, how do we improve our speaking mechanics? There's some ways to actually do it really easily. And the first is improving what I like to call eye scanning. And a lot of times when you have speaking problems or inefficiencies or stumbling, it's actually not because of your ability to talk quickly, but it's because your eyes are not keeping up with you when you're reading off a document. So one way to improve that is to narrow your Word document so that every time you have to reset your eyes when you go to the next line, your eyes only have to move a short distance. You can also use read mode, which makes two parallel panels on your Word document, which makes it narrow, and allows you to use an arrow key to move forward instead of having to use scrolling. And the read mode, if you look, is this little icon at the bottom of your Word document that looks like, a book that you would read in read mode. You can also practice reading backwards. That will help your eye scanning because you're going to train your eyes to just move really quickly from word to word. That's not a cure-all, but it is a really good drill, in addition with other drills to improve your eye scanning ability. Last, you can also use invisibility mode. If you don't know where it is, I've screenshotted the top tab of Verbatim on Windows. And invisibility mode is this little eyeball right here under the View tab. If you look on this big blown up version, I have it there. And what that does is it gets rid of all the non-highlighted text of cards. And that means that you don't have to have your eyes jump from word to word in large distances. Instead, you can just move from individual word to individual word much easier as if it were a paragraph. I personally recommend using this for the 1AC only, because that's the only speech you can perfectly prepare ahead of time. A lot of other speeches you're making on the fly, and invisibility mode takes a long time to process. It'll also sometimes crash your words, so don't overuse it, I guess. And so I recommend only the 1AC for that. Or if you maybe have your 1 and C prepared ahead of time, or you always go one off the abolition K with the same cards no matter what, I guess you could invisibility mode that. But you still have to send the full version of the document to your opponents, even if you use invisibility mode. Okay. Next, you can also work to improve your speaking, not just your eye scanning. And there's lots of different ways to do this. First, and my personal favorite, is to start slow and ramp up. And that way you'll preserve your tone, pitch, and clarity because you're going to be building off the baseline of just your normal voice. So if this is like a little chart of your time during your speech, and this is speed over here, you kind of want to go like something like that in your speed, where like this is your normal speaking. So start basically at your normal and then get faster. That way, if you slowly increase your speed, you'll still be using your normal tone, you'll still be using your normal pitch, and you can monitor to make sure you don't go so fast as to not be unclear. This is also, I found, the best way to get rid of that lawnmower humming we were talking about, because you don't actually make lawnmower noises in your normal speech. That only really happens when you imitate the sound of spreading, and this kind of gets rid of this. This is not just a drill, by the way. In your normal speaking, in your normal speeches, when you're speaking in front of a judge, it's often really good and smart to start with arguments at a little bit slower pace, so that that everyone in the room, including the judge, gets used to your voice. In addition to that, starting slow and ramping up, we also have it being intentional about breathing, which we talked about earlier on those mechanics. Make sure that you're breathing at times that make you, not jerky or stuttery, and that you're breathing only when you have to and not double breathing, because that's distracting. You can also use drills to improve your speaking. And there are lots of different drills that you can use, and this is not an exhaustive list, but two of my absolute favorite drills are the enunciation drill and the endurance drill, the two ends of normal speaking drills. The enunciation drill requires you, like it maybe sounds, to over-enunciate every single syllable of the words. So this means that you will talk much slower, so your goal here is not to go at normal spreading pace. It's in fact to actually stretch your mouth and jaw muscles so that you're more used to being able to speak at high paces while preserving enunciation when you're giving a normal speech. And it's important to say every single syllable, so every single one when you're enunciating, and enunciate as much as possible so that you're training yourself to, when you're giving a normal speech, to enunciate a normal amount. Alternatively, there's also the endurance drill, which you actually will go at spreading speed for. And the point of this, instead of normal spreading, is that you have to go for a much longer time than you would in a normal debate. And the reason this is really valuable is that a lot of times when you sound really good at the beginning of a debate speech, 5 or 8 minutes later, you sound exasperated, slow, barely getting through anything. And that not only sounds really bad from a judge's perspective, but it also limits your ability, your argumentative ability and flexibility, because you're actually going at a lot slower rate over the course of a whole speech than you maybe think you are. So it's good to try to, give a full 5 minutes at the same speed, and then maybe go up to an 8-minute, and then maybe go up to a 12-minute. And then if you're really feeling ambitious, you could try to speak for a full 16 minutes. I want to caution everyone, though, that you do not want to do this too many times. So do not overuse, because you can get really exasperated and winded and throw out your vocal cords. So don't overuse this. And also don't do this drill when you're at debate tournaments or over debate tournament weekends, because you're already doing a ton of speaking at a debate tournament. You don't need to also be doing 12 or 16 minutes of speaking at night all at once, because that's going to wear out your vocal cords. Okay. So that's all I have on the mechanics of speaking. So now I'm going to move on to speaking efficiency, and I'd like to begin with an exercise. So this is what I meant when I said that Barack Obama was a guest lecturer. I do not obviously know him personally and could not get him to come do my lecture with me, unfortunately. So I have instead grabbed a paragraph of his speech at the Democratic National Convention in 2004, and we're going to highlight it down as we would maybe highlight down our own speaking in order to be more efficient. And I'll start and preface this by saying that Obama is actually a very efficient speaker, so we're not going to pull as much out of here as we maybe would from a normal speech. And also, everything he said was carefully written ahead of time, unlike a debate speech, which happens a lot of times off the top of your head or off of just sparse notes. So the fact that we can get anything out of this suggests that there's always places to improve efficiency. So I'm just going to do a first run where I try to preserve basically all of the information from the speech, but just take out words that I don't think that are necessary. So I'm just going to say, in this election, our party, and then I'm going to say chose instead of has chosen. We don't really need has, verbs very much when we're giving debate speech. A man, because obviously we chose a man, because what else do we do? To lead us is not really necessary, so I'll say who embodies the best this country has to offer. There's no real way to shrink that down, I guess, quite yet, so I'll just highlight that. Then I'm going to say that is John Kerry. We don't need man because we've already said it earlier, and also it's kind of unnecessary and redundant. And now I'll go Kerry understands. We don't need his first name. Ideal, our community, faith, and service. That other stuff is redundant. They've defined his life. This is another good tip. A lot of times, because while it's a good reasoning word in normal conversation, is not super necessary in debate. If you say a claim and then you immediately follow it with a warrant, it's usually obvious that that thing is a warrant and you don't need a because statement. Now we'll say from heroic service, obviously it was his in Vietnam, to years as a prosecutor and lieutenant governor, again, obviously his years, through 2 decades in the Senate. We can plausibly infer that Kerry did not work in a Senate in some other country. He, again, we're going to skip that, devoted himself to this country. Again and again is redundant and weird, so we'll just say we've seen him make tough choices. When easier ones were available is the obvious follow to tough choices, so we're not going to highlight that, and we'll just say his values and his record affirm what is best in us. So great words from Obama about Kerry. I think, though, that we can even go more extreme and do a little bit more. So I'm going to highlight again, and we're going to lose a little bit of the content in the speech, but it's still going to convey all of the same ideas, and ultimately that's our goal. So we're going to take out some of the fluff that Obama has added and really try to just get the core concepts. So I'm going to say now the best this country has is Kerry. That basically summarizes the first 2 sentences. I'm going to add just a little who here so that I'm able to connect it. So is Kerry who understands? I can take out saying his name again. Community, faith, and sacrifice. They've defined his life from service in Vietnam as prosecutor, lieutenant governor, and then I'm going to add and in the Senate, he devoted himself to this country. We've seen him make tough choices. His values affirm what is best in us. So now we've gone from an initial speech and cut it down substantially while still basically preserving all of the content. This is what we want to do when we're giving efficient speeches. We don't have time to give large, grandiose, flowery speeches a lot of times. We really just have to pump out the arguments. And so being attentive to your own language is important in this way. I'm just going to add my name because this is basically now my speech. And if you watch The Office, then you get this joke. If not, I'm sorry. Okay, so moving on after this drill, what do we mean by efficiency? Because there's a lot of different types of efficiency, and I've been talking about many different ones, and I've kind of blended it together conceptually, and so I want to separate it out so that you know what we're talking about. So the first is syllabic efficiency, which is basically what it sounds like based on syllables. We want to use words that have the same meaning but as few syllables as possible. So let's say a good example of this is going from the word prohibits, which is 3 syllables, to the word stops, which is 1. And that way, unless you're in a tea debate defining the word prohibit, it wouldn't really matter which one you used. But over the course of a speech, cutting down a lot of syllables here, a lot of syllables there can end up being a short card or having an extra standard on a theory argument. And a lot of times those are the things that'll end up deciding close debates. And so being attentive to your syllables, especially across like an 8-minute speech, is really important. Second is sentence efficiency. So that is really making sure that your sentences are not overly inefficient. So a good example of that is, for example, our WALT evidence indicates that economic decline does not cause a global world war. And instead, you could just say, econ decline doesn't cause war, that's WALT. It has all the same, arguments, claims, it has basically the same content, but it's much shorter as a sentence, which, means that you are able to say more sentences in the time of your speech. So I'll just say Walt example because I'm not writing that whole thing out, and you should know what I mean. Next is paragraph efficiency. And this is like how many paragraphs or how many like groups of sentences does it take for you to establish a full argument? And there's not a perfect rule here, but in general, you should be mindful of how many chunks of time it takes you to accomplish a certain task. So does it take you 3 paragraphs to say Russia war doesn't go nuclear? If it does, maybe you need to reevaluate how efficient your paragraphs are and try to cut down the number of sentences it takes in order to accomplish that. These last 2, speech and argument efficiency, are actually not going to be covered in this lecture because they're basically what are more properly termed strategy. And this is, does your speech have a good mix of arguments in it? Are you able to accomplish like a threatening block? Or are you able to cover all of the negative positions adequately in the 2AC? Are you able to cover all of the block in the 1AR? Those are like speech efficiency things. And while, being a good speaker makes them easier, it's ultimately about argument selection. Similarly, argument efficiency is another one of those strategic questions. Does the overall makeup of your arguments represent an efficient, threatening set of arguments, or do you have redundancies? Are you extending 3 different topicality arguments in the block? Because if you are, an efficient 1A could answer all 3 of them with some of the same arguments, like only saying reasonability once, for example, or only saying functional image checks once. And so in that way, it's good to be attentive to whether or not your arguments are efficient as well. But that's not going to be covered in this lecture because that's more appropriately about strategic concerns. So we've talked a lot about what inefficient speaking looks like, and we've talked a lot about what efficient speaking looks like ideally, but how do we connect them? How does one become more efficient? And there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I like to kind of break it down into 3 big areas. The first one is practice. And practicing becoming an efficient speaker is not just located in debate, although it is important that when you're in debate, you do practice your efficiency with kind of things that we've already talked about. But it also matters to be efficient outside of debate. And that means being attentive to inefficient words that you use in everyday life. Words such as like, for example, are used all the time in everyday speech, literally, etc. We say these things without even thinking about them. I've probably said like a billion times in this speech already without even knowing it. And that contributes to, a bunch of extra words and a bunch of extra time that could have been spent on real content. And so being attentive to how you use those in everyday speech will translate to how attentive you are in debate to those terms. In debate, we have lots of what we call crutch words, like literally, probably, fundamentally. They're usually adverbs or modifiers that we use to strengthen the sound of our language that's ultimately not super necessary, especially when we repeat them. Another good way to improve your efficiency is flowing and shorthand. So just like speaking is not only a function of what you say, but also a function of how you breathe, efficiency is not just a function of the words you use, but also the words that you write down. And that's because more shorthand leads to having more content written down, which leads to less speaking off the top of your head because you can refer to more content, which ultimately leads to less rambling. And rambling is basically that really inefficient, so that you do kind of after you've read everything that you wrote down. And so if you're able to have a really efficient flow and a really concise shorthand, you can avoid that. Everyone needs to develop their own shorthand. I also recommend that you do it with your partner because then you can read each other's flows. But having kind of a system of symbols that are quick to write is important. So things like impact is often a little exclamation point. Solvency might be something like that. Link might be an L in a circle. Internal link, IL in a circle. Key to can be K2. Turns is that little T with a slash. Outweighs could be that. Usually leads to or causes is that little arrow. Increases is an up arrow. Decreases is a down arrow, and etc. You should go through and think about all the terms and phrases that you say in a normal debate and build a system to write them down efficiently on your flow. Finally, there are drills to make you more efficient. I have several that I like. The first is the record and highlight drill. This was the Obama drill that we did first. I recommend that you record your speeches after you give them and type out every single word that you say. And that alone is going to expose all of the inefficiencies, or at least a lot of them that you use. But the second part is going through and highlighting that so that you're able to see exactly where you wasted time and where you could have gotten it back. And then ultimately you want to give that speech again and see how much time you saved just by cutting out inefficiencies. If you have a lot of crutch words or words that you use too often, literally, probably, I used probably a lot when I was in high school. I said it like 10 times a speech. A good way to fix that is with what I call the sticky note drill, which just means write a list of all of your words that you overuse on a sticky note, and then 10 times a day, set an alarm on your phone and just read the sticky note out loud. And I promise you, after a week of reading those same words out loud 10 times a day, you will never say them again, and they will be banished from your vocabulary. Finally, we have challenge drills, which kind of test your paragraph efficiency and a little bit also your speech efficiency and your argument efficiency as well, which are to give yourself a really hard speech to answer, so maybe a 13 off 1 NC or a block that extends 4 DAs and a counterplan and also answers the case, and then to give a 1 AR, to really push yourself to be as efficient as possible, because if you're not efficient in a speech like that, you're just not going to be able to cover. And so testing yourself on that is really important as a way of maximizing your efficiency. A good little reminder that I've put down here is that becoming more efficient, and I wrote more efficiency, and that's great, is ultimately more like learning to cook than it is to ride a bike. It won't happen automatically, but you can make some big improvements quickly by just learning the basics, learning which words to remove, getting your shorthand better, and there are, like cooking, are always ways to improve, even if you're good at it. Even if you're a really efficient, concise speaker like Obama, there's always ways to cut some filler words out and make it even better. Also, unlike riding a bike, you can forget that the skills of efficiency over time, and so practicing consistently is important. You can't do speaking drills this summer, do nothing for 6 months, and then show up to a tournament in February and hope to be as good a speaker as you were at the end of camp. It doesn't work that way. And so constantly practicing all of these skills is really important. Okay. The last element of speaking that I want to cover is organization. And just like it's important to have the mechanics of your speaking down and have the efficiency of your speaking maximized, it's also important to stay organized in a speech and also in the broader debate. So the best way to think about staying organized is through the line by line, which is a general term that means arguments are made and answered in the order that they're made and answered. So when you are going down and answering your opponent's arguments or extending your own arguments and to answer them, you're doing so in the order that reflects the order that your opponent did it. And that way, it's easier for the judge to stay organized and for your opponents to stay organized and for yourself to stay organized. And that's why we flow in vertical columns, so that it's easy to catch the order. Things that can complicate line by line are like overviews, which are those giant walls of text that sometimes happen before debaters get to the, in order arguments and answers of the debate. When should you do overviews? All the time? Absolutely not. Similarly, should you do them never? No. A good rule of thumb for when you need an overview is only, and I mean only, when the info does not fit in the line by line. Okay, so some examples. If you are extending your advantage in the 2AC and the negative read solvency answers and internal link answers and impact defense, you don't need to explain your whole advantage at the top of the 2AC. You just need to answer their arguments. And because you've answered their arguments, you will have, by default, explained your arguments sufficiently, and you can move on. However, if you're extending a DA, and let's say the 2AC dropped an impact that was in the 1NC DA, you can put that in the overview because there would be no place to address that impact on the line by line, and it also would be good to kind of explain it in the beginning and do your impact calculus there. One way to organize within the line by line that I really like is the EACM method, or extend, answer, compare, more. And this is a good way I have found to organize your line by line when you're giving speeches. So the first thing that you should do when you're doing line by line debate is extend your argument. So you want to make sure that all pieces of your argument, say the internal link of your DA or the uniqueness of your DA, solvency of your counterplan, is being extended. Second, you want to, and so that's extend your arg. Next, you need to answer their argument. And so, that's also pretty self-explanatory. If they said the economy is high now, you can say the economy is low now. Often the extension and the answer can be similar, but sometimes, or even the same argument, but a lot of times you want to answer their specific warrant. So if you're reading an economy disadvantage and your uniqueness evidence says that the economy is doing well now, and because of, the bond market, and the 2AC says economy low now because of coronavirus, you can't just say the economy is high now because of the bond market. You also need to answer that specific warrant. So you may say something like, extend the economy is high now, the bond market provides strength, they're wrong about the coronavirus. Next, what you want to do is what's called compare, which compares the strength of your argument to the strength of their argument. And there's lots of different ways that to do this. Maybe it's author quals, or evidence quals, or evidence quality, or number of warrants, or recency. There's lots of different ways to prove that the strength of your argument is better. So back to our economy example, we might say extend the economy is high now, the bond market provides sufficient long-run strength. They're wrong about the coronavirus. It won't last long and recovery will be quick. Prefer our evidence is from an economics professor. Theirs is from a blog, and also our evidence is more recent. Finally, and really only if we need to, we have more, which means that sometimes, especially if you're giving a block speech, or you're a 1AR on an important issue, we want to add to our argument. And so we might add more evidence or more analytics, reference a cross-ex moment, etc. And these add further new warrants or new strength to your argument. So back to our first example, extend the economy is high now, the bond market provides long-run strength, coronavirus doesn't hurt the economy, it will recover quickly, and there's lots of quantitative easing. Prefer our evidence, it's from an economics professor, and it's more recent. Here's two more cards that answer their argument. It's kind of a full line-by-line answer package to what they said. All of these pieces may not be always necessary. Sometimes you need to combine them, but it's a good way of thinking about how to approach line-by-line speaking in an efficient, organized way that will keep the rest of the debate intact. Okay, so a lot of times this is how the line-by-line will get ordered. And so just to kind of give you a little example of the line-by-line, I wanted to just diagram it. So let's say they do something like no impact. And if you were going to answer it, we could do something like yes impact, which was our extension. We could say the impact defense is wrong, which is our answer. We could say our EV is newer, which is a comparison. And then we could read more cards on the impact, which is more. And that it kind of takes the structure of the line by line, and that's a good way of thinking about organizing your speaking if you find yourself disorganized. Okay. That is the end of section 1. I want to move on now to section 2, which is shorter, which is about re-giving those speeches or giving what we call redos. The main purpose of giving a redo is to give a speech a second time, I'll highlight that, without the acute competitive pressure of a debate. But with the increased attention to mechanics efficiency, organization, and strategy. So I want to break this down. Giving a speech a second time is obvious. You gave it a first time when you gave it, and now it is second. But for it to be without the acute competitive pressure means you're not doing it in the immediate stressful situation of a debate. You don't have to, you're not racing to find where all the evidence is. Your partner is not yelling at you. You're not sitting in a loud room. It might not be late at night. You might not be, underslept and underfed because you're at a debate tournament. Or maybe it's roughly similar, but you're giving yourself kind of the best shot possible to give a good speech. And that's important because when we give ourselves the best shot possible to give a good speech, it increases the chances that we'll end up giving a good speech. And then we can use those tips and tricks that we developed in our normal speaking moving forward. That also means that we need to have increased attention to mechanics, efficiency, organization, and strategy. And we want to improve in all four of those areas when we're giving a speech. Mechanics, efficiency, and organization we've talked about in this lecture, so you should go back or look at your worksheet and find ways to improve mechanics, efficiency, and organization when giving your redo. Strategy is a little bit different. It's not what we've talked about so far because we're not really talking about speaking, but it's important to analyze the strategy of your speech carefully. Did you need that extra DA? Was that overview important? Did you need that one card, or would it have been better to spend a little bit more time answering theory? Those questions you should ask yourself really attentively because that's how you improve your speaking going forward. So I've divided kind of all of this up into 3 steps for giving a successful redo. And they're right here, and on your worksheet there should be a little 3 steps, and you can fill it in as we go. The first step is to assess. And that asks, what went wrong? What can I improve? What skills do I need to build? And those can be in several areas. Efficiency, maybe you spent way too much time giving an impact overview and the content wasn't really great. Maybe your mechanics were bad, you had a lot of breathing problems, or you were too slow, or you were unclear. Maybe you had an organizational problem, you went out of the line by line, or you read more cards before you extended your original argument, so you did extend, answer, compare more out of order. All of those things are potential pitfalls that you need to avoid and improve when you're assessing the speech. Second, and I'll highlight that so you know that it's there. Second is replicate, and that means you want to replicate the general conditions under which the speech happened. So that means that you're answering the same set of arguments. You're not going to assume magically that your opponent was worse when you're giving a redo. So that means, answer the same thing. You are giving yourself the same prep time that you had in the debate to kind of generally replicate the conditions, and you're giving yourself the same speech time in order to do it, so that you can kind of mimic the situation that you would be in a real debate. Obviously, these are not always fixed. Sometimes you might really want to take a little bit extra prep time to try to perfect the speech, and that's okay. Sometimes you might want to make it a little bit more challenging and spend less time on the speech than you would normally, and so that way you can make it more difficult. Either way, you play around with these different concepts in order to replicate, but in general, it's good to try to keep roughly the same prep time and roughly the same speech time in order to try to give the best possible speech you could have under those conditions. Finally, we have give, which is pretty simple. You just want to give the redo, and it's good to write down comments, give it to someone who is able to give you critical, ideas and feedback for your speech. And if you can't give it to anyone, record it, listen to it yourself, and do the same things. Do the same assessment. What went wrong? Were there still efficiency problems? Were there still mechanical errors? Were there still organizational errors? And you can keep giving your speech until you're satisfied. And so I like to call this the ARG method 1, because ARG is kind of like argument, and we use that shorthand to mean ARG, but also because ARG kind of sounds like a pirate, and I like to imagine this little pirate guy telling you to keep doing your redos. So every time you're deciding whether or not to do a redo, remember this little guy here. This is your speech right there. He's telling you to redo it and thinking about that. So there you go. That is the lecture on this topic on speeches and redos. And I hope that you're able to integrate some of these things into your everyday practices and to refer back to your worksheet when you're designing your redos and when you're prepping to give speeches, so that you use the best tactics and strategies possible. That's it.